You are a young girl, no more than 15, dragged through the gates of a towering ziggurat that pierces the Babylonian sky. The clay steps burn beneath your bare feet, though the night air clings cold against your skin. Incense smoke coils through the corridors, mingling with the sour stench of sweat, fear, and blood. Torches sputter against walls carved with gods you do not recognize, figures with wings and lion heads glaring down as if judging your trembling body. The chants rise before you see the chamber. Priests in white robes murmur invocations while scribes scratch lines into damp clay tablets. Each mark is a record, each word a chain. Rough hands pull you forward, and suddenly you stand in the harem hall, lit by dozens of flames. The room is not silent. Men laugh, women cry, musicians pluck strings to mask what is about to unfold. Your body is not your own. Your shame is not private. It is spectacle. And then it strikes you. The king's pleasure is not desire, but demonstration. This is not intimacy, it is theater, a ritualized game of humiliation meant to prove power. Babylon, the world's first great city, crowned with gardens that touch the sky, hides its darkest chambers behind walls of wonder. If these buried shadows already grip you, take a moment to subscribe and share in the comments where you're watching from. It fuels more unearthings like this. History's darkest corners are vast, and together we drag them into the light. For centuries, Babylon was the jewel of Mesopotamia, the city of Hammurabi's code, the birthplace of writing, the architects of ziggurats that rose like man-made mountains. Its gates shimmered blue with lions and dragons etched in gold. Its name became synonymous with grandeur, ambition, and legend. But behind the brilliance of the Ishtar Gate, behind the precision of its laws and the splendor of its gardens, lay a machinery of control that turned human lives into tokens. The so-called sexual games of the kings were not whispers of scandal or accidents of lust. They were recorded, codified, and systematic, etched into clay, justified by priests and enforced by empire. The ziggurats of Babylon were not only temples of stone, they were engines of memory. Each chamber holding rituals that blurred the line between sacred worship and calculated cruelty. What you saw in the opening moments was no isolated scene. It was the foundation of a system so deliberate, so systematic, that centuries later clay tablets still whisper of its precision. When the armies of Babylon marched, they did not simply take territory, they harvested people. Captives were not just carried away in chains, they were sorted, processed, and branded by value. Picture a dusty courtyard outside the Ishtar Gate. Lines of prisoners stretch into the distance, men with broken spears, women clutching children, youths trembling. Priests and soldiers walk through them as if inspecting livestock. A girl's hair is pulled aside to check her teeth. A boy's chest is pressed to judge his strength. The scribes record 7 maidens of age to bear children, 4 boys suitable for service, 2 old women unfit. These are not names, they are categories. And this is where the horror begins. For the Babylonians, conquest was not chaos. It was psychology turned into empire. Families were deliberately torn apart in public squares so survivors would carry home the fear. A mother forced to watch her daughter dragged away while her son was castrated on the spot, knew that her grief was itself a message: resist Babylon, and this will befall you too. Contemporary chroniclers, both friendly and hostile, describe this process in detail. They note how the spectacle of separation, parents screaming, children clutching, was more effective than the sword. Entire villages surrendered at the whisper of these practices. Herodotus, though writing later, spoke of Babylonian women being compelled to sit in the temple of Ishtar and submit to strangers as ritual offerings. While some scholars debate the extent of this sacred prostitution, what is clear is the empire's tendency to cloak humiliation in divine justification. A concubine was not merely enslaved, she was told she served the goddess. The king's violation became a holy rite. By ritualizing atrocity, Babylon erased resistance at the level of the soul. And still, the system deepened. Ledgers excavated from the ruins revealed chilling details. People were not counted as individuals, but as inventory, listed alongside grain or spices. A tablet might read, 15 women, excellent condition. 2 children, defect. The language strips away humanity with the efficiency of bureaucracy. Scholars call it the birth of recorded law, but for the enslaved, it was the birth of industrial dehumanization. The kings themselves staged spectacles that blurred cruelty with theater. Court feasts often featured concubines forced into competitions, who could dance longest, who could obey humiliating commands without faltering. These were called games in euphemistic records, but their purpose was deadly serious. To humiliate a captive before hundreds of nobles was to cement power not just over her body, but over the watching empire. Every chuckle of a nobleman, every cheer of a guard, reinforced the message: resistance is useless. Economic incentives fueled the machine. Commanders returning from campaigns were rewarded not merely with gold, but with human quotas. A successful general might bring home 10,000 captives, processed and redistributed to temples, harems, or markets. The market itself fluctuated. In times of famine, children were cheap. In times of prosperity, exotic captives from distant lands fetched fortunes. We even have fragments of tablets where officials debate the value of Ethiopian dancers versus Anatolian maidens. The coldness is staggering. Transport was another layer of horror. Caravans of chained women marched for weeks across deserts, their feet blistering, their bodies wasted. Mortality rates reached as high as 15%, yet in the ledgers, this loss was noted with the same casualness as spoiled grain. Acceptable losses, one record chillingly implies. On ships moving captives down the Euphrates, the dead were thrown overboard, their absence marked in clay as defect. This was not the chaos of war. It was logistics. And for those who survived, identity was stripped away. Captives were renamed with Babylonian titles. Heads were shaved to erase tribal marks. In ritual ceremonies, old gods were mocked as priests forced captives to bow before statues of Ishtar or Marduk. What should have been private humiliation was transformed into public theater. Resistance was broken not only through chains, but through the systematic erasure of self. For families left behind, the trauma spread like poison. Parents in border villages sometimes scarred their daughters, burning their faces, breaking their teeth to make them less desirable to raiders. Some even mutilated sons to prevent their conscription as eunuchs. These desperate acts echo in folk stories preserved for centuries. Archaeological digs reveal shackles not only in palaces but in common homes, suggesting families prepared themselves for the inevitable. Fear itself was a weapon wielded by Babylon. This, then, was the machinery of exploitation, conquest, categorization, humiliation, and erasure, and all of it cloaked in the authority of empire. What looked from the outside like splendor, the Ishtar Gate, the Hanging Gardens, was in truth a facade built atop rivers of suffering. Behind the lions carved in blue tiles were ledgers that valued women like livestock. Behind the music of lutes in the harem was the muffled sobbing of those trapped in the king's games. Section. The deeper one looks, the clearer it becomes. Babylon's atrocities were not isolated acts of cruelty, but carefully cultivated rituals designed to sustain power. Each generation inherited not only the palaces of its fathers, but the systems of domination perfected by them. At the center of this machinery were the so-called sexual games. These were not games in the sense of amusement, but spectacles of control. Chroniclers describe how captives were lined up in grand halls, forced into mock ceremonies of marriage with the king, only to be discarded publicly. The king's touch was not an honor. It was a reminder that their lives belonged entirely to him. Such performances were staged before audiences of nobles, priests, and foreign envoys. The humiliation was strategic. By turning intimacy into spectacle, Babylon made domination visible. Religious justification made the practice almost unassailable. Priests declared that the king, as earthly representative of the gods, enacted divine will through these rituals. The goddess Ishtar, associated with both love and war, was invoked to sanctify what was essentially abuse. A woman taken into the harem was told she was chosen to embody the goddess. In truth, she was stripped of identity, forced into roles that erased her humanity. The manipulation of faith ensured compliance not only from victims, but from the society that watched. Records reveal how systematic the process was. Tablets preserved in museums detail quotas for temple offerings, numbers of women and children required for festivals, listed alongside quantities of grain and oil. Some tablets record pregnancy cycles, with midwives reporting to priests as if tracking livestock yields. This was not rumor, it was administration. Even death in childbirth was not tragedy but accounting, noted as defect, removed from tally. Transported captives were funneled into different fates. The most beautiful and young were funneled into royal harems. Others became entertainers at court feasts. Still others were sacrificed in rituals or forced into temple prostitution. The lines between sacred and profane blurred entirely, until the empire itself could not distinguish between devotion and degradation. Survivors were sometimes forced to become selectors. Women taken in earlier raids, now broken and indoctrinated, were used to sort new captives, deciding who would be sent to the king, who to the priests, who to the markets. This created cycles of complicity, ensuring that victims themselves became instruments of the machine. It is one of the cruelest truths of Babylon's system. Oppression perpetuated itself by forcing the broken to break others. Public festivals turned humiliation into entertainment. Captives were paraded, stripped, and mocked before crowds. Euphemistic texts call these marriage markets or rites of passage, but eyewitness accounts from visiting envoys describe them as spectacles of cruelty. For the crowd, it was proof of the king's divine power. For the victims, it was a living death. Legal codes reinforced it all. Hammurabi's code, often praised as the earliest law, reveals chilling priorities when read closely. Offenses against women were not seen as crimes against the person, but as property disputes. Compensation went not to the victim but to her owner or father, or, in the case of captives, to the king himself. Rape, in other words, was legally framed as property damage. The victim's pain did not exist in law, only the owner's loss of value. The raids themselves were planned with precision. Scouts mapped villages, noting where fertile women lived, where youths could be taken. Campaign seasons were timed not just for military advantage, but for harvest of human lives. This cold calculation transformed warfare into a kind of agriculture of exploitation, with human beings as the crop. The horror is in the normalization. Over time, entire generations grew up knowing this system as natural. Children born in harems never saw their mothers free. Villages adapted by hiding their daughters, creating secret rituals to protect them, but the fear was inescapable. Parents told stories not of mythical monsters, but of Babylonian raiders. Fear became folklore. Pause and consider. This is what civilization looked like when stripped of compassion. The Hanging Gardens may have been one of the 7 wonders of the world, but beneath their roots were thousands of bones, lives consumed to sustain the illusion of grandeur. The empire's glory was built on a foundation of systematic dehumanization, where even the most intimate acts of life, love, birth, union, were turned into instruments of humiliation. When archaeologists brush clay dust from tablets in modern museums, they uncover not only the triumphs of early civilization, but also its darkest truths. Those ledgers, those cold tallies of human bodies, are the unflinching witnesses to a nightmare that Babylon tried to bury beneath monuments. But the clay does not forget. The records remain, whispering through time of games that were anything but play. And so the story builds toward its climax. Babylon was not merely a city of walls and gardens, but a machine of exploitation. Its kings were not merely rulers, but orchestrators of humiliation. Its victims were not merely forgotten captives, but entire generations erased, their suffering preserved only in fragments of clay. The most wicked sexual games of the Babylonian kings were not scandal, they were policy. By now, the patterns of Babylonian cruelty no longer appear as scattered fragments of depravity. They align into something far more terrifying, a machine. What looked like individual acts of lust or chaos was, in truth, a state apparatus, designed, perfected, and perpetuated over centuries. The most wicked sexual games of the Babylonian kings were not the scandals of a decadent few, but the cornerstone of an imperial system that weaponized intimacy itself. At the center of this system were the breeding programs. Clay fragments discovered in temple archives reveal midwives reporting directly to priests and scribes, noting not just births but cycles, fertility, and failures. Human reproduction was reduced to agricultural math, pairings arranged for maximum yield, children born not as blessings but as quotas. If 1,000 captives were processed, scribes expected perhaps 100 to survive to productive adulthood. 9 out of 10 could be lost to malnutrition, disease, or despair. Yet this was not considered failure. It was efficiency. The kings themselves oversaw these cycles. Chroniclers record festivals where the king would select new concubines from captives paraded before him, marking them with dyes or jewelry to indicate their category. Some would become dancers, some wives of the god, some breeders for the next generation of slaves. This process was public envoys, nobles, and priests invited to watch. The degradation was not hidden in shadow, but celebrated as divine theater. To resist was to invite mutilation or death. This spectacle fed the empire's momentum. Every humiliation was also propaganda. Villages on the frontiers heard whispers of these games, and knew resistance was suicide. Better to surrender than see daughters dragged into ritual. Psychological warfare replaced armies, as Babylon's reputation traveled faster than its chariots. Chroniclers note entire cities capitulating at the mere rumor that the king's harems were hungry for new captives. Fear became as valuable as iron. The cruelty even touched law. In Hammurabi's code, often lauded as the birth of justice, women are invisible as persons. A wife accused of infidelity could be drowned. A daughter used as collateral for debt could be handed to creditors. In the context of the king's games, these codes were less about order than about reinforcement. By framing women as property, the law sanctified the very system that turned them into spectacle. And so, the games endured because they were normalized. Priests declared them holy, laws declared them legal, soldiers declared them honorable. What might once have been shocking became mundane. The people who lived under Babylon came to accept that intimacy itself was no longer private. It belonged to the state. But the true horror of this system lies in its self-perpetuation. Survivors of the first generation, broken, scarred, and indoctrinated, became the selectors of the next. Women who had once been dragged into chambers were forced to stand beside priests and choose which of their sisters would serve the king. Some whispered warnings, others complied in silence, but all were trapped in complicity. It was the cruelest genius of Babylon, turning victims into instruments, until resistance itself collapsed into inevitability. As Babylon perfected its machinery of exploitation, the games became more elaborate. Woven into the empire's very calendar, raids were not random, they were seasonal. Scouts mapped the lands, noting harvest times, festivals, and when villages were most vulnerable. Armies descended like locusts, not only to seize crops but to reap human lives. In official ledgers, captives were tallied in the same columns as barley or dates, as if daughters and grain were commodities of equal worth. Festivals became the stage for the empire's most chilling spectacles. On holy days, captives were paraded through the streets, stripped of identity, presented as offerings to Ishtar. The euphemism cloaked horror in sacred garb, but eyewitness accounts describe jeering crowds, mock marriages, and public humiliations that blurred religion with theater. What should have been worship was transformed into spectacle, binding the population not with faith but with fear. Public participation reinforced the system. By attending, by cheering, by watching silently, the people of Babylon became complicit. And complicit societies rarely rebel. When atrocity is normalized as festival, resistance becomes heresy. Legal records confirm this normalization. When a captive was violated, the crime was not defined by her suffering, but by damage to her owner's property. If she was the king's property, fines went to the palace. In some cases, the woman herself was executed, not as punishment for defilement, but to erase the evidence of a noble's insult to the crown. The law protected the machinery, not the victim. Economics sharpened the cruelty. Commanders were given bonuses for delivering high numbers of quality captives. Exotic slaves, Egyptian, Nubian, Anatolian, were prized for their rarity, fetching higher value at markets. Chroniclers even describe shortages in times of peace, when demand for new concubines outpaced supply. Thus, war was not merely conquest, it was harvest. Kings launched campaigns not just for territory, but to restock their harems. This systemic exploitation had one final devastating effect. It rewrote the moral fabric of entire generations. Children raised in harems never knew their mothers free. Young boys grew up watching women paraded as offerings and learned that intimacy was not love but domination. Girls born to enslaved mothers grew into replacements, inheriting chains instead of legacies. The cycle was endless until cruelty itself was seen as natural order. Pause for a moment and imagine a world where the most intimate acts of life are never private, never sacred, but always staged, recorded, and consumed as proof of power. Imagine growing up believing that humiliation is holy, that degradation is law, that captivity is destiny. This was Babylon's legacy, not merely walls, gardens, or gates, but an empire that turned human intimacy into currency. By the time the empire's glory waned, the damage had already been done. The reputation of Babylon as a place of corruption endured for centuries. Prophets and poets spoke of it not just as a city, but as a symbol of human depravity. Its ruins whispered of grandeur, but its name became synonymous with excess, cruelty, and decay. And at the heart of that memory were the games. The most wicked sexual games of the Babylonian kings, the rituals of humiliation that turned an empire into a legend of infamy. Civilizations are remembered as much for what they built as for what they destroyed. Babylon dazzled the ancient world with its walls, its gardens, its laws etched in stone. Yet beneath the grandeur lay a truth too terrible to erase. An empire that turned the most private of human experiences into instruments of domination. The sexual games of its kings were not aberrations. They were policies woven into the fabric of empire, normalized until they became invisible to those who lived within them. What remains now are fragments, broken tablets, scattered chronicles, whispered echoes in the writings of foreign envoys and prophets. They describe not only the splendor of temples and palaces, but the suffering hidden inside them. Archaeologists unearth ledgers that record women and children alongside wheat and oil, reminders that the machinery of exploitation was as systematic as taxation. These ledgers endure, silent but damning, refusing to let the empire's crimes be buried beneath myths of wonder. The scars of these systems outlasted Babylon itself. Generations carried the trauma in silence. Folk stories of raiders, tales of daughters hidden or scarred to deter capture, survived long after the city fell. The Bible and other texts turned Babylon into a symbol of corruption, a warning etched into cultural memory. That unchecked power will always find ways to twist intimacy into terror, and that the spectacle of humiliation, once normalized, can corrupt entire societies. And perhaps that is the most chilling lesson of all. Babylon's gardens may have withered, its walls crumbled, its ziggurats reduced to dust. But the structures of control it pioneered, the reduction of people to property, the use of humiliation as propaganda, the masking of cruelty beneath divine justification, are patterns we still recognize in later empires, and even in shadows of the present. The faces change, the justifications shift, but the logic of dehumanization endures. To remember these victims is to deny Babylon the last victory of erasure. The names may be lost, but the dignity of their suffering remains when we speak of them not as numbers, but as human beings whose lives were consumed by a system masquerading as glory. History forces us to look into these shadows, not to wallow in horror, but to confront what unchecked power does to the most vulnerable. If this unearthing stirs something in you, if the ledgers of Babylon's cruelty echo uncomfortably close to truths we still wrestle with, subscribe and share in the comments where it hit hardest. Because only by remembering the darkest chambers of the past can we guard against their return. The ruins of Babylon whisper still, and it is up to us to listen.